The lantern's glow trembled against blood-stained walls. 3 surgeons, once celebrated in Richmond's finest halls, whispered prayers they no longer believed. At the center lay Eleanor Blackwell, her eyes unblinking, her silence unbearable. What began as medicine had turned into madness, and Virginia would never forget her name. In the waning autumn of 1819, the Blackwell estate stood as a proud remnant of Virginia's old gentry. Tall oak trees guarded the grounds, their roots pressing deep into soil that had seen both revolution and ruin. From the outside, it was the picture of stability, a brick manor lined with iron balconies, the slow creak of its shutters a lullaby for passers-by. Yet within, silence ruled with an iron hand. Eleanor Blackwell, 23 years of age, had inherited the estate after the sudden death of her father. Though her beauty was whispered about in Richmond's parlors, it was not beauty that defined her. It was her quiet. Neighbors described her as thoughtful, sometimes too thoughtful, as if she lingered in another world while walking among them. Her mother had died in childbirth, her brother at sea, and now she stood as the last of her line. Alone, and yet not alone. For those who visited the house swore it breathed differently after dusk. Inside, the scent of damp wood and lavender clung to the air. The servants, loyal yet frightened, often spoke of Eleanor's late-night wanderings. They claimed she carried a candle from room to room, whispering to someone unseen. On more than one occasion, a chambermaid fled her service in tears, refusing to return, insisting that Eleanor was not merely a mistress of flesh and blood, but a host to something far older. By the winter's first frost, her condition became undeniable. Guests reported fainting spells, sudden screams echoing from the halls, and bloodied handkerchiefs left abandoned upon the stairs. Physicians from Richmond were summoned, each prescribing tinctures and bleeding, yet none could explain the rapid decline of a woman who seemed otherwise untouched by illness. It was during this time that 3 surgeons, all respected men of science, received a desperate summons from the Blackwell estate. Their names, Dr. Jonathan Wainwright, Dr. Samuel Harker, and Dr. Elias Crowther, were known in every Virginia medical society. They arrived not merely to treat a patient, but to confront what they would later call the ordeal. When the carriage pulled up to the estate, the men remarked on the stillness. Not a bird stirred in the trees, not a dog barked from the neighboring farms. The house loomed over them like a sentinel, its windows aglow, though no sound came from within. Little did they know, the moment they crossed the threshold, their lives and their minds would unravel in ways history dares not fully record. Would you have stepped inside, knowing whispers of madness clung to its walls? Or would you have turned away, leaving Eleanor to her fate? Tell me in the comments, what choice would you have made? The carriage wheels ground to a halt against the gravel drive. Moonlight struck the windows of Blackwell Manor, casting pale reflections like watchful eyes across the surgeons' faces. Dr. Wainwright, the eldest among them, tightened his cloak against the November chill. He had seen madness before, in war hospitals and city wards, yet the stillness here pressed heavier than blood-soaked battlefields. The front doors opened before they could knock. A servant, gaunt and pale, ushered them inside with little more than a whispered greeting. The air within smelled faintly of iron and herbs, as though someone had been burning sage to ward off more than illness. The surgeons exchanged silent glances. Inside the grand hall, portraits of Eleanor's ancestors watched from the way, their eyes seeming to follow each movement. The fire crackled in the hearth, yet the warmth did little to ease the sense of dread. The men set down their medical satchels, their boots echoing against the wooden floorboards like intrusions upon sacred ground. Eleanor was waiting above. They found her seated in a high-backed chair in her chamber, her figure draped in pale linen. Candlelight revealed a face both fragile and determined, her dark hair framed eyes that seemed too wide, too fixed upon something beyond the room. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the tremor of someone who had not slept in days. "Do you believe in curses, gentlemen?" she asked. The surgeons hesitated, each trained to dismiss superstition. Yet none could deny the weight of her words. Wainwright answered first, with clinical calm. "We believe in ailments of the body, Miss Blackwell, nothing more. but Eleanor only smiled faintly. "Then you will not save me." Her condition revealed itself in sudden fits. Convulsions gripped her body without warning, her hands clawing at unseen tormentors. Dr. Harker examined her pulse, finding it irregular, as if her heart beat to a rhythm unknown to the human frame. Dr. Crowther leaned closer, studying her pupils, which dilated in response to nothing visible. The surgeons began their debate. Was it hysteria, a malady of the nerves, perhaps poisoning? Yet each theory dissolved beneath the evidence. Eleanor bled from her nose without cause, whispered names no one recognized, and stared at corners of the chamber as though expecting figures to step forth. That night, as they retired to their quarters within the manor, none of the surgeons found rest. For each swore they heard Eleanor's voice echoing through the halls, though she had never left her room. If you were in their place, would you trust the science you carried, or the fear rising in your chest? Tell me below, what guides you when reason begins to fail? The surgeons agreed to keep watch through the night. Eleanor's chamber, draped in velvet curtains, became a theater of shadows where candlelight flickered against carved wooden beams. A single grandfather clock marked the hours with a hollow chime, its sound deep enough to rattle the bones of those who listened. Dr. Wainwright insisted they remain together. "Madness, gentlemen, may deceive the eye when one is alone," he cautioned. So they sat in uneasy silence, notebooks at hand, their eyes fixed upon their patient. Eleanor lay reclined, her chest rising with shallow breaths. Her skin bore no fever's heat, yet beads of sweat clung to her brow. At times her lips moved without sound, as though she conversed with invisible attendants. When Dr. Harker leaned closer to listen, her voice broke through, faint but unmistakable. "They will not let me sleep." The words chilled him, for they seemed directed not at him, but at something standing behind him. He turned sharply, finding nothing but the quiver of curtains against the cold draught. By midnight, her body jerked upright in a spasm so violent it toppled the chair. The surgeons rushed to restrain her, their hands pressing against her wrists and shoulders. Eleanor's eyes rolled back, her mouth foamed, and yet, through the convulsions, she began to laugh, a brittle, hollow laugh that froze each man where he stood. Dr. Crowther, the youngest, muttered a prayer beneath his breath, though he would later deny it. Science, he told himself, demanded composure, but in that moment the sound of her laughter seemed less human than the shriek of an owl in a graveyard. When the fit ended, Eleanor collapsed against the bedding, her face pale as marble. She whispered a single name: Mother. The surgeons recorded the event in detail. Fits, hallucinations, disordered speech. Yet none of their writings captured the atmosphere of that chamber, the feeling that the air itself thickened around them, pressing into their lungs as though the hoe used desired silence, not healing. As dawn broke, they noted Eleanor's pulse had steadied, though her eyes remained closed. Dr. Wainwright declared she must rest, but none among them dared to leave her unattended. Even in her stillness, she radiated unease. When they finally stepped into the corridor, exhausted, a servant approached with trembling hands. "Did you hear it, sirs?" she asked. "Hear what?" Wainwright replied. "The voice that called from the walls," she whispered. It was not hers. The surgeons exchanged glances, each unwilling to admit what they feared, that the Blackwell estate held voices of its own. "Would you have stayed another night in that room, or fled while the sun still gave you mercy?" The second night descended upon Blackwell Manor with a weight that pressed on every stone of its foundation. By dusk, the wind clawed at the shutters, and the trees outside bent as if trying to retreat from the house itself. Within, the atmosphere thickened, the silence holding the servants hostage in their own home. Dr. Wainwright ordered that the men rotate their watch. "One will rest while two remain awake," he declared, though none truly desired to close their eyes. Dr. Harker volunteered for the first vigil, Crowther beside him. Wainwright retired to the adjoining chamber, though even in supposed rest he kept his coat on, his boots unlaced but ready. Eleanor did not stir as the night began. She lay still, her breath slow, her eyelids flickering faintly as though she dreamt. The chamber smelled faintly of candle wax and iron. Harker, ever the skeptic, noted the ordinary features of the scene in his journal: pulse steady, complexion pale, but stable. Yet even as he wrote, his hand trembled with something he dared not record, the sensation that someone was reading over his shoulder. At midnight, the sound began, a low knocking, muffled, as though from beneath the floorboards. Crowther froze, his pen slipping from his grasp. The rhythm was deliberate, steady, too precise to be the work of rats. It carried through the room, stopping only when Harker whispered Eleanor's name aloud. Her eyes opened, wide, glassy, unblinking. She turned her head toward the ceiling, lips parting slightly. "They want you to hear it too," she murmured. Crowther rose, searching the floor with a candle. No loose boards, no hollow echo. Still, the knocking resumed, this time from the wall behind Eleanor's bed. Suddenly she convulsed, her body arching upward. The surgeons rushed to restrain her, but her strength was unnatural, her hands striking with the force of a grown man. Her voice, when it came, was not her own. A guttural tone erupted from her throat, speaking in a cadence neither man recognized. Dr. Harker shouted for Wainwright. The elder surgeon burst into the chamber, his face pale at the sight before him. Eleanor writhed against their grip, her eyes rolled white, her voice continuing its unholy litany. Wainwright ordered them to hold her still while he drew a vial of laudanum. With great effort, they forced a few drops past her lips. Slowly the struggle weakened. She collapsed back onto the bed, drenched in sweat, her breath ragged. But long after she stilled, the knocking continued. Not from the floor, not from the walls, from the hollow spaces above, in the attic where none of them yet dared to go. Would you have climbed those stairs, knowing something waited above, or left the house in silence, pretending you never heard it? By the third day, exhaustion etched itself into the surgeons' faces. Yet it was not Eleanor's condition that haunted them most. It was the sound that traveled through the manor, the knocking, sometimes faint, sometimes sharp, always purposeful. The servants refused to enter the upper floors, crossing themselves whenever the word attic was spoken. Dr. Wainwright, determined to restore order through reason, insisted they investigate. "Illness may manifest in delusion," he said, his tone firm, though his eyes betrayed unease. "If we prove the source of the sound, we can restore calm for her and for ourselves." Together, the three men ascended the staircase. Dust lay thick upon the banister, the air colder with each step upward. By the time they reached the narrow door to the attic, their breath fogged in the lamplight. The wood of the door bore scratches, as though some animal had clawed to get in or to get out. The hinges groaned as Wainwright pushed it open. A wave of stale air escaped, carrying the odor of moth-eaten cloth and old timber. They raised their lamps. The attic stretched wide, beams sagging with age, trunks and furniture draped in sheets like forgotten monuments. At first there was only silence. Then, from the far corner came the whisper, not the rhythmic knocking they had grown accustomed to, but a hushed voice. It carried no words they could comprehend, only the cadence of speech. The sound slithered across the boards, weaving between the trunks until it seemed to circle them. Dr. Crowther called out, "Who's there?" His voice cracked, betraying his youth. No reply came, only laughter, low, fleeting, like a child's stifling mirth behind a curtain. The men advanced cautiously. Wainwright struck a trunk with his cane, revealing only dust. Harker yanked away a sheet, uncovering a rotting chair. Yet the whisper continued, slipping just beyond reach. Suddenly, Eleanor's voice pierced the silence, from below, in her chamber. They froze. She was calling for them by name. "Jonathan, Samuel, Elias." Her tone was urgent, pleading. Without another word, they abandoned the attic, slamming the door behind them as they descended. When they reached her room, they found her upright in bed, her eyes wide, tears streaming down her face. "They are upstairs," she whispered, clutching Wainwright's sleeve. "Do not go again. They have been waiting for you." The surgeons exchanged looks, each unwilling to confess what he had truly heard. Yet in the silence lay the admission. Eleanor had known where they had gone, though no servant had left her side. If you heard a whisper in the dark calling your name, would you answer, or would you pray it never called again? Morning light crept through the heavy curtains of Eleanor's chamber, yet it brought no relief. The surgeons gathered in the drawing room, their faces drawn and hollow from sleepless nights. A fire burned in the hearth, but none leaned close to it. The warmth felt foreign, as if the house rejected comfort. Dr. Wainwright laid his notes upon the table. His handwriting, normally precise, trembled across the page. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are men of science. We must not lose ourselves in shadows and whispers." He spoke with authority, but his hands betrayed a tremor. Dr. Harker leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What we heard last night was no delusion. Eleanor's voice called to us from below while we were above. Explain that to me, Jonathan. What organ, what nerve could conjure such impossibility?" Crowther, the youngest, sat apart from the others. His eyes were distant, fixed upon the window where frost clung in pale patterns. "She knew our names," he murmured. "She called each of us as if she had been waiting. How does one account for that?" Silence settled over the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Finally, Wainwright exhaled heavily. "We must treat her illness as it presents itself. Bleeding, laudanum, careful observation. This is a case of hysteria magnified by isolation and grief, nothing more." But even as he said it, doubt weighed upon his words. The surgeons returned to Eleanor. She was calmer in daylight, her expression weary but lucid. When Harker examined her pulse, she met his gaze with unnerving clarity. "Do you still believe this is an illness?" she asked softly. He faltered. "We are here to help you, Miss Blackwell." Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Then you are already lost." Later that day, while preparing his instruments, Crowther discovered something unsettling. His scalpel, left polished the evening before, was now rusted at the edge. No moisture, no neglect could account for such decay in a single night. He said nothing, slipping it back into his case, yet the weight of it gnawed at him. By evening the household grew restless. Servants whispered of doors opening on their own, of footsteps in empty corridors. Several begged leave from their duties, but Eleanor refused to let them go. "No one leaves this house," she ordered, her frail voice carrying authority that none dared oppose. The surgeons exchanged uneasy glances. If they were prisoners of science, she was its warden. If you were bound to that house, forbidden to leave, would you have obeyed, or risked everything to escape into the night? By the fourth night, the surgeons resolved to act. Dr. Wainwright, steadfast in his conviction that Eleanor's affliction was bodily rather than spiritual, insisted upon bloodletting. "Excess humors corrupt the mind," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of medical tradition. The others, though reluctant, yielded to his authority. Eleanor lay pale against her pillows as they prepared the procedure. The chamber was silent, but for the scrape of metal instruments against the tray. Crowther's hands shook as he bound her arm with cloth. Harker averted his gaze, his skepticism about the treatment matched only by his fear of what might happen if they refused her any remedy at all. Wainwright steadied his scalpel and made the incision. Dark blood flowed swiftly into the waiting basin. For a moment all seemed ordinary, until Eleanor's eyes snapped open. She began to speak, not in English nor in any tongue the surgeons recognized. The words rolled from her lips with harsh, guttural cadence, her voice layered as though 2 or 3 speakers echoed within her throat. Crowther staggered backward, nearly dropping the basin. Wainwright barked for calm. "Hold her still!" Harker pressed her shoulders against the bed, but her body writhed with unnatural strength. Blood spilled over the basin's rim, staining the sheets. Eleanor's gaze fixed upon Wainwright, her pupils wide, unblinking. "You cannot cut them out," she hissed suddenly in perfect English. "They are not in the blood." The words struck him cold. His hand faltered and the scalpel slipped, leaving a jagged mark upon her skin. Eleanor laughed, a broken, rasping laugh that echoed across the chamber. At last, the bleeding slowed, her body collapsing into exhaustion. The surgeons bandaged her arm, their own hands trembling as though they had endured the ordeal themselves. Wainwright wiped his brow, refusing to meet the eyes of his colleagues, but the damage was done. Crowther whispered that her pulse had grown weaker, not stronger. Harker noted that her skin had turned ashen, her breath shallow. Far from healing, the procedure had left her closer to death's threshold. When they finally extinguished the candles, intending to leave her to rest, Eleanor stirred once more. "You will not save me," she whispered, her voice faint but certain. "You will join me." The three men froze, each unwilling to acknowledge what the others had already heard. Outside, a storm gathered over Virginia, thunder rolling across the hills like a funeral march. If you were the surgeon holding the blade, would you have cut deeper or dropped the instrument and fled? That night, the heavens opened. Rain lashed against the manor's windows, and wind howled through the trees like a chorus of the damned. The shutters rattled in their frames, and the roof groaned beneath the weight of the storm. Inside, the house seemed alive, every creak and sigh echoing like breath from unseen lungs. The surgeons huddled in the drawing room, their satchels open, notes scattered across the table. Dr. Harker, whose skepticism had thus far anchored him, now appeared shaken. "This is no mere fever," he admitted at last. What voice spoke through her? What tongue was that? Wainwright bristled. "Illness corrupts the mind. In delirium, the brain invents language, sound, nonsense, nothing more." His words carried force, but his eyes betrayed unease. Crowther, pale and sleepless, stared at the fire. "It was not nonsense," he whispered. "It was speech. Someone, or something, spoke through her." He hesitated before adding, "And it was not alone." A loud crash interrupted them. One of the shutters upstairs had torn free, slamming against the wall. They rushed into the corridor, the storm's roar pressing in. The sound of hurried footsteps followed, though no servant had joined them. At the far end of the hallway, Eleanor appeared. Her white gown clung to her frame, her hair loose and wild, her face aglow with lamplight. She should not have been walking at all, yet she stood upright, her posture unnaturally rigid. "Why are you leaving me?" she asked, her voice carrying even above the storm. Wainwright stepped forward, urging calm. "You must return to bed, Miss Blackwell. Your body cannot endure." Her head tilted sharply to one side, and she began to laugh. The sound was brittle, echoing down the hall in jagged waves. "It is not my body you should fear for." With sudden violence, she turned and sprinted toward the staircase. The men gave chase, their boots striking the floorboards like thunder. But when they reached the landing, she was gone. Only the storm remained. The great doors of the manor swung wide, rain sweeping across the entry hall. Wainwright shouted for the servants, but none answered. At last they found her standing barefoot upon the threshold, gazing into the darkness beyond the gate. Lightning illuminated her face, her eyes wide, mouth open as though listening. "Do you hear them?" she asked softly. "They are louder in the storm." The surgeons dared not simply, for in that instant each man heard it too. Voices woven into the thunder, calling their names one by one. Would you have stepped outside into that storm or barred the door, hoping the voices would fade? By morning the storm had passed, but the household was no calmer. The servants gathered in the kitchen, their whispers thick with fear. Several demanded their wages and safe passage away from Blackwell Manor. They had endured sleepless nights, voices in the halls, and Eleanor's unnatural fits. Now they swore the house itself had turned against them. When Wainwright entered, the room fell silent. His commanding presence held them still, but their eyes betrayed panic. One elderly maid, her apron torn, stepped forward. "Sir, this place is not right. We hear doors opening, though they are locked. We see her shadow walking when she sleeps in her bed. We cannot remain." Wainwright's voice was sharp. "You will remain. Your mistress requires care. To abandon her now is to consign her to death." But Dr. Harker, standing at his side, noted their trembling hands, their pale faces. He lowered his tone. Perhaps we should allow some to leave. Fear breeds hysteria. Eleanor herself settled the matter. Appearing in the doorway, she silenced them with a single command. No one leaves. Her voice, though weak, carried strange authority. Even Wainwright paused. The servants lowered their eyes, cowed by something they could not name. Only Crowther dared to look directly at her. He saw not a fragile patient, but a figure strangely commanding, her presence heavy, as though she were no longer merely Eleanor Blackwell. That evening, rebellion stirred again. 2 footmen attempted escape, slipping through the side gate before dusk. They were found an hour later in the orchard, kneeling in the mud, their faces blank. They spoke of hearing a woman's voice calling them from the trees. Either could recall why they had obeyed. The surgeons convened in secret, their unity fraying. Harker accused Wainwright of blind arrogance. This is no longer medicine. You endanger us all. Wainwright thundered in reply. Would you surrender reason to shadows? I will not. Crowther said nothing. He could still see Eleanor's eyes from that morning, the way she had silenced the servants with a word. His scalpel, once rusted, had now corroded further, though untouched since. That night the household fell into uneasy quiet. Doors barred, candles extinguished early. But silence offered no safety. From the upper floors came the sound of weeping, soft, unbroken, like a mother mourning a child. The servants swore it was Eleanor. Yet when the surgeons checked, they found her fast asleep, her chest rising and falling in perfect calm. The orphanage's halls echoed with laughter, but behind every smile was an untold sorrow. The children who lived there had no one else, abandoned, forgotten, or deliberately placed in the care of strangers who claimed to offer safety. Their innocence made them vulnerable, their trust easily won and even more easily betrayed. Locals spoke of the way the children changed after arriving. At first they were wide-eyed, frightened, clutching small keepsakes from a lost home. But within weeks, something shifted. Some grew unnaturally silent, as if words themselves were forbidden. Others laughed in ways that unsettled even the most hardened caretakers, laughter that sounded rehearsed, empty, or forced. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. The most disturbing reports came from the children who spoke at night. They whispered to one another in voices not their own, sometimes reciting passages that no child should know, in languages they had never been taught. Caretakers wrote in journals that certain children seemed to age faster, not in their bodies but in their eyes. The gaze of an 8-year-old sometimes carried the exhaustion of an old D-man, and no one could explain why. There were nights when groups of children would disappear from their beds, only to be found hours later in the chapel, kneeling before the altar with blank expressions, as if guided there by something unseen. The nuns who tended to them insisted it was only sleepwalking, but the repetition of these episodes made the explanation feel hollow. Most disturbing of all were the drawings the children left behind. Scribbles on paper, etched into wood, even smeared across the walls in charcoal or ash. Always the same. Tall, faceless figures with elongated arms, watching from corners or dark doorways leading into endless voids. When asked who these figures were, the children gave different names, but their descriptions were always identical. The orphanage should have been a place of refuge, but instead it became a theater for something else, something that used the children's innocence as its stage. Every account, every diary entry, and every whispered confession pointed to a single truth. The children were not safe. They were chosen. It began quietly, as if the house itself had taken a breath and held it. The night was cold, the halls of the orphanage unusually still, and the wind outside rattled the windows in a steady rhythm. When the morning bell rang, one bed was empty. At first the nuns insisted it was nothing. Perhaps the child had wandered outside or hidden in one of the storage rooms. But a full search of the building revealed nothing. No footprints in the snow, no sign of forced entry or escape. The child was simply gone. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. The other children seemed oddly calm. When questioned, some said the missing child had been taken home. Others whispered that he had been called to the woods. Their words didn't align, but their expressions did. Not fear, but acceptance, as though they had been waiting for it to happen. The missing boy's belongings remained untouched. His shoes neatly placed by the bed, his blanket folded back as if he had risen willingly. His favorite toy, a carved wooden horse, sat on the windowsill. Dust had not yet settled on it, suggesting it had been moved only hours before dawn. In the chapel, a candle burned longer than it should have. One of the nuns swore she had extinguished it the night before, but at sunrise it flickered. Its wax pooled strangely into shapes that resembled hands reaching upward. When the priest examined the altar, he found fresh scratches carved into the wood, too deep for a child's fingers to make. The town was informed, but the search parties found no trace. The sheriff, uneasy but desperate to quiet rumors, filed the report under runaway. Yet those who lived near the orphanage knew better. They had heard the crying at night, the sound of voices layered on top of one another, as if more than one person were speaking through the same throat. This first disappearance was dismissed by officials, but within the orphanage walls, it became the unspoken beginning of a cycle, a warning, a shadow that promised it would not stop at just one. The priest was not a man given to fear. He had presided over funerals, exorcisms, and the darkest confessions of parishioners. Yet after the first vanishing, something in his composure cracked. He began avoiding the east wing of the orphanage, where the empty bed still sat untouched, as though waiting for its occupant to return. Late one night, unable to carry the burden alone, he summoned a trusted colleague from a neighboring parish. In hushed tones over candlelight and scripture, he confessed what he had witnessed. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. He admitted that the missing boy had come to him days before his disappearance. The child claimed to hear voices at night, not whispers from the dormitory, but something beneath the floorboards. A chorus, low and rhythmic, calling his name again and again. The boy had begged the priest to move his bed, swearing that if he stayed another night near the chapel wall, something would take him. The priest had dismissed it as childish imagination, yet he confessed to his colleague that on the night of the boy's vanishing, he too had heard it. A low murmur rising from the stone foundation, almost like a prayer spoken backward. He described seeing shadows in the chapel that did not match the candlelight. They seemed to stretch against the walls, pulling toward the altar, bending unnaturally, as though obeying something unseen. But his most damning admission was this: he had found a note on the altar that morning, a scrap of parchment in the boy's handwriting. It contained only one line, written again and again: "They promised me a family." His colleague, shaken by the confession, urged him to alert the bishop, yet the priest refused. He said the orphanage was already under suspicion for neglect and cruelty. To reveal such things would lead to its closure, scattering the children into the wilds of Vermont with no protection. Worse, he feared the truth would not be believed, and that the voices, if provoked, would not stop at one child. His final words of confession carried a weight he could barely lift. "It was not the boy who left us. It was we who surrendered him, and we will surrender more." It began as a rumor among the children. They whispered of a hidden book, black as soot, tucked away behind the altar. Some claimed they saw the priest clutching it at night, murmuring words that weren't in the Bible. Others swore it was chained to the floor as though the book itself might escape if left unbound. One autumn morning, a caretaker sweeping the chapel found something wedged beneath the altar cloth. At first glance, it looked like a LED. Its cover cracked with age, the leather blackened as though scorched by fire. Its pages smelled of iron and damp earth, not of scripture. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. Inside, the caretaker discovered symbols, spirals, inverted crosses, and diagrams of circles filled with strange lettering. But scattered between these markings were names. Not ordinary names, but those of the children already gone. Each vanished child was listed in neat script, as though someone had recorded their fate before it ever occurred. When the priest found the caretaker with the book, his reaction was not anger but dread. He seized it with trembling hands, muttering prayers that cracked in his throat. He forbade the caretaker from speaking of it, threatening damnation if the secret left the chapel. But in private, the priest could not deny what was written. The pages did not end with the missing. Several blank spaces remained, lines waiting to be filled. At the top of the page was a single word: offerings. From then on, the priest's sermons shifted. He spoke less of heaven and more of sacrifice, less of salvation and more of obedience. The children said his eyes looked different, sunken and dark, as though he had been drained by something unseen. But what terrified them most was what happened during evening prayers. The priest began reciting from memory, not the Psalms, not the Gospel, but passages no one else recognized. His voice would dip into a growl, echoing through the chapel, while the candles flickered out of rhythm with the wind. Some claimed the shadows on the walls moved when he spoke, as though the book had given him the language of something not human. From that night onward, no child dared sit near the altar. And though the priest tried to keep the book hidden, the children knew. It was watching them, waiting for its pages to be filled. It was the whispers of the black book that drove them together. The children who remained, thin, hollow-eyed, ebbed, and trembling, began to believe that they were marked. Each night they counted their names, tracing their fingers over the chapel pews as though searching for proof they still existed. Some had already seen their own names faintly inked on the priest's hidden pages. By candlelight in the cramped attic where the wind howled through cracks in the wood, they made a pact. If the book wanted offerings, then they would deny it. They pricked their fingers with sewing needles, smearing their blood across a scrap of cloth torn from a blanket. That was their covenant. No one would surrender, no one would walk willingly into the shadows. If one was taken, the others would fight to remember them. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. At first, their pact gave them courage. They began to resist the priest's late-night summons, whispering prayers of their own instead of answering his chants. They clutched one another when the chapel bells rang at strange hours, refusing to go alone. And when the priest's voice slithered through the halls, promising salvation to those who obeyed, they buried their faces and prayed not to hear him. But courage is a fragile thing in a place where even the walls seem to listen. One night, as the packed children huddled together, a younger boy began convulsing. His eyes rolled back, his lips moving with words too ancient for his small tongue. The older orphans tried to hold him down, but the sound that left his throat was not his own. It was deep, guttural, and strangely familiar. It matched the cadence of the priest's forbidden prayers. When he awoke, he whispered something that silenced them all. He already knows our pact. From that moment, the children realized they were not simply resisting a man or a book. Something larger, something ancient was aware of them. The pact was not their shield, it had become their challenge, a defiance that marked them more deeply than the ink on those cursed pages. Still, they clung to it because the alternative was surrender. And surrender meant joining the names in the black book's waiting lines, destined to vanish like the others. The priest believed no one saw him at night. He believed his secrets lived only in shadows, but children are watchful, and in a place where silence ruled, even the smallest creak became a revelation. It was an older orphan, thin as bone and sharp-eyed, who first followed him through the corridor one midnight, her bare feet soundless on the wooden floor. She hid behind the cracked door of the chapel and saw what no child should ever see. On the altar lay the black book, open wide, its pages fluttering though there was no wind. The priest had drawn a circle of ash on the stone floor, symbols etched into it that shimmered faintly like embers. He placed objects inside the circle, fragments of bone, locks of hair and scraps of cloth torn from children's beds. Each piece was tied to a name, each name tied to the book. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. The child watched as he cut his palm and let blood drip onto the parchment. The book absorbed it eagerly, its ink lines glowing red for a moment before fading into darkness again. Then he began to chant. The words were harsh and broken, not Latin, not English, but something older, something not meant for living tongues. The orphan swore later that the walls of the chapel groaned as he spoke, that the very candles bent their flames toward the book as though pulled by a breath. And when the priest called out a name, one belonging to a boy who had been missing for weeks, the air filled with a low hum like the buzzing of insects inside the walls. The ritual ended in silence. The priest closed the book, kissed its cover, and pressed his forehead to it as though in prayer. Then he walked out, his robes stained with blood and ash, never noticing the wide, horrified eyes watching him from the shadows. When the girl told the others, their pact shifted. Fear was no longer enough. They needed to understand what he was doing, why their names were written, and what power the book held over them. But the more they whispered, the more they realized the truth none of them dared say aloud. The priest wasn't serving God anymore. He was serving the book. By the following week, the children began to notice subtle changes in themselves. Small marks appeared on their wrists and ankles, faint at first, like scratches, but persistent. They were not from play, not from accidents. They resembled tiny symbols etched into the flesh, as if the black book had reached out to claim them. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. Some children awoke with bruises shaped like letters on their bodies. Others felt a cold pressure, as though invisible hands had pressed them into place. Whispered voices followed them in the hallways, repeating their names, promising that they would soon join those already taken. Even the youngest, who had not seen the priest's ritual, would sometimes speak aloud at night, chanting syllables no one had taught them. The older orphans realized that these marks were a warning, a tether to the Black Book. Those who bore them were watched more closely. The priest's midnight rituals were not merely symbolic, they targeted children whose names were next on the list. One night, 3 of the marked children gathered in the attic, clutching one another and whispering fervent prayers. "We must hide our names," said the eldest, a girl no older than 12. "If the book cannot see us, it cannot take us." But hiding was not enough. They discovered that even without writing their names aloud or speaking of the book, the marks would appear regardless. No candle, no locked door, no prayer could erase them. They were chosen. By the 10th night, one of the children vanished. No scream, no struggle, no sound at all. Only the mark remained, dark and pulsing, on the wrist, of a friend who had watched helplessly. The remaining orphans whispered of her as though she had never existed. And yet in dreams they could hear her calling their names, trapped between the lines of the Black Book. The priest continued his ceremonies, oblivious to the children's awareness. To him, the marked were sacrifices in progress, stepping toward a destiny he alone understood. But the children could feel it. The closer the ritual came to completion, the colder and darker the manner became. If you were one of the marked, feeling invisible eyes upon your skin, would you run or accept your fate? The manner itself seemed to shift around the children. Hallways that had been solid one day became corridors of shadows the next. One evening, as the eldest orphans hurried from their attic refuge to fetch a candle, they found a passageway that had not been there before, a narrow hallway leading into darkness, silent and still, yet humming with an almost imperceptible vibration. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. They hesitated, sensing instinctively that the corridor was not ordinary. Its walls absorbed sound, muting the footsteps of the children, as if the house itself was swallowing their presence. Faint whispers echoed from deep within, repeating their names in voices that were neither male nor female, young nor old. The children's hearts pounded, yet some invisible force compelled them forward. As they proceeded, the hallway seemed endless. Doors appeared and disappeared along the walls, some ajar with dark interiors, others sealed as though walled by the air itself. At one point, a cold draught brushed their necks, carrying the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. It was not a natural chill, it felt deliberate, as if the manor were testing their courage. One of the children, trembling, reached for a doorknob. The moment she touched it, heed it. The hall seemed to pulse and she was thrown backward. The others rushed to help her, but the hallway behind them had vanished. They were trapped, the corridor stretching on infinitely, a maze of shadows and whispering names. From the darkness ahead, a faint glow appeared. It was a candle, burning with a sickly green flame, hovering just above the floor. Beneath it lay the Black Book, open and beckoning. The children realized then that the hallway was a construct, an extension of the book itself, a snare for the marked. They backed away, fear rooting them to the spot, but the whispers grew louder, angry, insistent. "Come," they hissed. "Your name is next. You cannot escape." One brave child, the eldest, shouted for them to turn back. But the manor would not allow retreat. Walls shifted, the floor slanted, and the ceiling seemed to descend. In moments, the children found themselves at the threshold of a room they had never seen, a chamber lined with shadows that writhed like living smoke. And there, standing before the black book, was the priest, eyes gleaming, robes stained, chanting in the ancient guttural tongue. The children knew without question, this hallway, this room, was where the next vanishing would occur. If you found yourself in a corridor that shifted with every step, with unseen forces guiding your path, would you fight or surrender to its pull? For weeks the priest had carried the weight of his actions silently. To the town he remained a figure of piety, delivering sermons and tending the children with the appearance of care. But within the walls of the orphanage he wrestled with something far darker than doubt. Each ritual, each name inscribed in the black book, etched a mark not only on the child, but on his own soul. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. Late one night, after the children had been sent to bed, he sat alone in the chapel, the black book resting on the altar before him. Candlelight flickered across its pages, revealing names written in ink that seemed alive. Throbbing faintly as if in anticipation, he pressed his palms against the worn wood, whispering prayers that had long since lost their meaning. Memories haunted him. He recalled the terrified eyes of the first child who vanished, the pleading of the older orphans when they discovered their friend gone, and the whispers that followed him through the halls, warning, judging. For the first time, he understood that the book demanded obedience not out of faith, but out of fear, and that he had become its servant rather than its master. As the night deepened, he tried to resist. He opened the book and attempted to erase a name, to remove the mark of the next offering, but the ink smoldered, refusing to be altered, almost mocking his feeble attempt. He realized that every action he had taken had bound him irrevocably to its will. His heart pounded as he contemplated the children, innocent and yet marked, each step drawing them closer to the fate he had helped orchestrate. He could no longer plead ignorance. Each vanished child, each scarred wrist, was his doing. He had chosen ritual over mercy, obedience over compassion. For hours he sat in silence, haunted by whispers not of the children, but of the book itself. A voice, sharp, accusing, echoed in the hollow chapel, reminding him of the covenant he had made, names in, lives taken, obedience required. By dawn, he was broken, yet determined. He could not undo the past, but perhaps he could find a way to protect the remaining children. He knew it would not be easy. The black book was patient and its demands relentless. And yet, for the first time in weeks, a sliver of resolve ignited within him. Would you, knowing your hands had caused such suffering, attempt redemption, or resign yourself to the darkness you helped create? In the days that followed, the priest explored the manor with a desperate focus. He knew that somewhere way, thin its ancient walls, beyond the eyes of the children and servants, lay a secret passage, a corridor forgotten by time, hidden in the architecture itself. It was said to lead to the cellar, then to a series of tunnels beneath the orphanage. He hoped it might offer an escape, a way to safeguard the children from the black book's relentless pull. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. The passage was not obvious. Panels in the woodwork shifted only when pressure was applied in precise combinations. The walls seemed alive, resisting intrusion. Dust thickened in the corners, undisturbed for decades, and the air carried a musty, earthen scent that hinted at both decay and concealment. The priest pressed onward, hands trembling, chanting quietly under his breath. He discovered a narrow opening behind a carved tapestry depicting the manor in happier times, a family gathering around a fireplace. When he pulled the tapestry aside, a slit in the wall yawned before him. It was only wide enough for one man to pass at a time, and a faint draught, icy and unwelcoming, blew from its depths. Lighting a candle, he stepped inside. The passage was claustrophobic, stone walls slick with moisture and the floor uneven, forcing him to watch each step. Faint scrawls in charcoal marked the walls. Names of children he didn't recognize, long vanished or perhaps never documented. The sense of being watched pressed against him, a living weight that made his breath quicken. After what seemed like hours, he emerged into a low-ceiling chamber beneath the orphanage. Here, the air was colder still, heavy with the scent of earth and stone. The walls were lined with niches, each one empty now, but the remnants of old rituals lingered. Ash, candle stubs, and a faint residue of blood. The priest realized with horror that this hidden passage had been a conduit for the Black Book's power. Children taken upstairs vanished into rooms no one could find. They had been guided or perhaps compelled through these tunnels. The manor itself had become an instrument of selection, a labyrinth for the marked. From the shadows, a whisper slithered along the walls, calling a name he did not recognize, and he understood the truth. The book was patient. It was everywhere, and the passage, though hidden, did not escape its grasp. If you stumbled upon a secret corridor beneath the house, lined with the echoes of the vanished, would you walk forward, or turn back and pray you had never discovered it? Eleanor had been silent for days, her once restless energy replaced by a strange stillness. She no longer laughed nor cried. She only stared into corners of the room that seemed empty, yet were filled with shadows only she could perceive. One evening she beckoned the remaining children and the priest to her chamber. Her voice, fragile yet commanding, carried a weight that made even the priest hesitate. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. I know what the book wants, she whispered, her eyes reflecting candlelight like twin flames. It is not just our lives it desires. It is our obedience, our fear, and the very essence of who we are. Every mark, every ritual, every child vanished is part of something larger, something older than this house, older than any of us. The priest, pale and trembling, asked, "What can we do? How can we fight it?" Eleanor's gaze pierced him. Fight it? No. We can only understand it, and perhaps redirect it. The book responds to attention, to recognition, to defiance, to hidden knowledge. The children listened, wide-eyed, sensing for the first time that she was not merely a victim. She had been observing, learning, and enduring what no one else could. Eleanor's revelation was chilling in its clarity. The Black Book was not a passive instrument. It was sentient, perceptive, and unforgiving. It did not merely take, it judged. It measured, and it waited. She led them to the attic where she had secretly recorded patterns she observed, the timing of the priest's rituals, the ways the children were marked, even the subtle movements of the manor itself. If we understand the rhythm, she said, we can anticipate, we can survive the next vanishing, perhaps even save one of us. Her words were met with a mixture of hope and terror. For the priest, it was a bitter acknowledgement. Eleanor, the very child he had thought weak and powerless, possessed insight that had eluded him. She had become both guide and prophet, standing between the Black Book and the innocents still under its threat. But her revelation carried a haunting undertone. She warned that each attempt to redirect the book's will might provoke it further, that the manor itself could act in defense of its dark covenant. Every step taken to protect the children was also a step into deeper peril. As the candlelight flickered and shadows danced around them, Eleanor concluded, "We are not merely surviving the house. We are surviving its master, and its master is patient. If you were in her place, staring into a darkness that understands you, would you obey, resist, or attempt to outwit something older than reason itself?" The children, emboldened by Eleanor's revelation, began to whisper of escape. The Black Book's hold, though strong, seemed momentarily understood. If they could move with precision, if they could time their steps around the priest's rituals, perhaps one among them could flee the manor and summon help from the town. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. They waited until the night of the new moon, when darkness would mask even the faintest candlelight. Eleanor led them through the corridors, their bare feet soundless on the cold, worn floorboards. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward them, every whisper from the walls promising doom if they faltered, yet the children moved as one, their pact binding them against fear. Reaching the hidden passage beneath the chapel, they descended slowly, clutching one another's hands. The air grew colder as they approached the cellar, and faint scrawls in charcoal on the walls seemed to twist into faces of children who had vanished before them. Eleanor held her breath but pressed forward. The priest's distant chanting reminded them that the manor and its dark master was never far. As they reached a narrow corridor that led toward an exit known only to Eleanor, the youngest tripped. A soft thud echoed, louder than it should have, and for a heartbeat, silence followed. Then a whisper surged from the stone walls, a name called out, their name, drawn out in tones not belonging to any living voice. Panic surged, and the children froze. Eleanor grabbed the youngest, whispering urgently, "Do not look back. Do not hesitate. Move." But hesitation had consequences. The walls themselves seemed to shift, narrowing the passage, forcing them to press against cold stone. A faint pressure on the chest of each child reminded them that the manor was alive, aware, and angry. At last they saw light, the faint glow of moon through a half-buried side door. Eleanor's hand reached for it, but a figure appeared behind them. The priest, his face pale, eyes wide with horror and determination. He raised his hand, not in blessing, but as if to command the darkness itself to seize the children. The children scrambled. One vanished before their eyes as if swallowed by shadow. Screams echoed down the corridor, mingling with the wind outside. The rest stumbled into the night, hearts pounding, lungs burning, and knew in that instant escape was possible, but survival was uncertain. If you were in their place, fleeing a manor that seemed alive, with a sentient darkness hunting you, would you run blindly or try to turn its rules against it? The children stumbled into the forest beyond the manor, their lungs burning, hearts hammering against ribs as if trying to escape the shadow of Blackwell Manor itself. The night air was crisp, but the chill could not compare to the cold weight of the manor's unseen gaze pressing on their backs. Each step carried them further from the building, yet none could shake the sensation that something was following, patient and relentless. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. Hours later they reached the outskirts of the village, where a few night watchmen still lingered by lantern light. Shivering and pale, the children approached, their eyes wide, barely able to form words. They spoke of the manor, of the Black Book, of vanished friends, and the priest's forbidden rituals. The villagers exchanged glances, some with disbelief, others with the shadow of unease that comes when children tell stories too vivid, too precise to dismiss. A farmer, returning late with his cart, noticed one of the children alone and clutching a blood-stained piece of cloth. He questioned her, and her description of the rituals, the ash circles, the whispered names, the carved symbols, chilled even the hardiest men. They called for the constable, who arrived at dawn, skeptical but compelled to investigate the report due to the children's terror and the seriousness of their claims. Yet the village could offer only limited aid. Roads to the manor were treacherous, the forest thick and unforgiving, and the children's fear had made them forget precise directions. When a search party arrived at the manor's gates, the place appeared as serene as any countryside estate. Windows reflected the morning sun, doors hung closed. No trace remained of the passageways or the horrors that had unfolded. Still, villagers claimed to hear children laughing in the distance, voices unaccounted for, singing the strange cadences the priest had used in his rituals. Some reported glimpsing shadows at the windows, though no one had entered. Each testimony carried the weight of dread. The manor had not released them. It had only allowed them to step back into the world. The priest, meanwhile, remained inside, pale and frantic, consulting the Black Book with renewed urgency. He muttered that the children's survival was temporary, a defiance he could not tolerate. The manor's walls seemed to pulse in approval of the book, and he feared that the next vanishing would claim not only the children left behind, but anyone who dared witness their escape. If you had seen them flee, faces streaked with terror, would you believe their story, or assume the darkness was merely in their imagination? By the time dawn broke over the village, the priest had retreated into the deepest chambers of Blackwell Manor. The events of the past nights had fractured his mind. Fear gnawed at him, not only for the children who had escaped, but for the power he had tried and failed to control. The Black Book lay open before him, inked names pulsing faintly in rhythm with his heartbeat. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. His hands shook as he tried to decipher the book's demands. The rituals had grown more complex, requiring precision that seemed beyond mortal comprehension. Symbols shifted on the pages when he looked away, letters rearranging themselves in ways that made the words nearly impossible to read. Each misstep felt like a direct summons from some unseen force, and the priest feared the punishment for failure. He began to see them, visions of children, past and present, floating just beyond the periphery of his sight. They whispered his failures, naming the vanishing ones, accusing him silently of betrayal. Their eyes glimmered with an eerie intelligence, and in their voices he heard not innocence, but the cold calculation of the manner itself. The priest attempted one final ritual, desperate to reclaim control. He "Doctor, you the ash circle larger, placed objects within it, bones, hair, remnants of cloth, but the book refused to respond. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room, thickening until they seemed almost solid. The manor groaned, floorboards creaking as though alive, and he realized in horror that he was no longer the master. As the chant left his lips, the shadows converged, and the book's pages flipped violently on their own. Names glowed, then vanished, leaving blanks. He recognized one, the last of the marked children, the one he had hoped to save. In that moment he understood the truth. The book required not obedience, but surrender. Unable to bear the weight of guilt and terror, the priest fell to his knees. The shadows swirled around him, whispering accusations, promises, and final judgments. The candle flames flickered violently, then extinguished. Silence fell, a silence heavier than any night, pressing down with inevitability. When the villagers eventually entered Blackwell Manor days later, they found the priest collapsed, unresponsive, and the black book closed on the altar, as if resting. No trace of ritual remained, save faint ash and the cold, unyielding air that seemed to exhale from the manor itself. The children had vanished from the manor for good, and the priest had been consumed, not by men, but by the weight of the darkness he had tried to command. If you had watched him descend into shadows of his own making, would you pity him, or fear that the darkness might still reach out to you? Years passed, and Blackwell Manor stood abandoned, its windows shuttered, its walls rotting beneath the weight of neglect. The village whispered of the horrors that had taken place within, though many dismissed the stories as the fanciful fears of children. Yet the manor exuded a presence, a subtle, constant unease that lingered even on the sunniest of days. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. Those who dared approach the grounds reported strange occurrences. Shadows that moved against the light, distant whispers that carried no source, and the faintest imprint of footsteps on paths overgrown with weeds. Occasionally, villagers claimed to see figures at the windows, small, fleeting silhouettes of children staring outward, their eyes hollow and knowing. The black book, the instrument of so much suffering, vanished with the priest. Some said it had returned to the shadows, waiting, patient as ever, for the next generation to stumble across its cursed pages. Others believed the children who had escaped carried fragments of its knowledge, a seed of the darkness planted in the outside world. Despite decades of investigation, no one could fully explain the disappearances, the markings, or the priest's final descent. Scholars who later studied records of the manor found inconsistencies, names appearing in census lists that could not be traced, children whose births were never recorded, and faint references to rituals that never existed outside the village's oral history. Yet the impact was undeniable. Families who lived near the manor spoke of unease, nightmares, and inexplicable misfortune. Travelers who passed the estate hurried along the road, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. Blackwell Manor, though empty of its human occupants, had not released its grasp. It remained a sentinel of dread, a testament to the dark will once commanded by a man who underestimated the forces he tried to control. Even today, the manor's reputation endures. Some say that on quiet nights, when the wind stirs the broken shutters, the whispers of the vanished children can be heard. Others swear that the Black Book waits still, hidden in a corner, ready to claim those curious or desperate enough to seek its knowledge. The legacy is silent, yet insistent, a warning etched into the stones and shadows of Virginia, a cautionary tale that even the most pious and well-intentioned may fall to the darkness that waits quietly in forgotten corners. If you were to stand before the manor now, centuries later, feeling the weight of its history pressing down, Would you turn away or step inside and confront the silence it keeps?